Okay, so hey everyone. So what I'm gonna talk a little bit, very briefly about what I do and kind of our background, and then talk through this process that we kind of work through that we call design for conservation technology. That kind of helps us think about projects and how to create them in the way so that they're the most successful possible outcomes from the work that we're doing. So, and then at the very end, I'll talk about some pitfalls that I've seen in the past and maybe explain a little bit more what those are. So, as you heard earlier, I spent the beginning of my career working in aerospace, working on satellite propulsion systems. And it was during that time that, while I was still really excited about that work, I kind of wanted to find a way to use my engineering knowledge to try and do some better in the world. And so I ended up kind of getting involved in conservation, ocean conservation specifically, with the Center for Ocean Solutions at Stanford. And so first started kind of thinking about how do we bring technologies into illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. And it was that work that kind of brought me into the National Geographic family as well. So in 2013, I became an emerging explorer. And then 2016, I became a fellow at Nat Geo, kind of thinking through these issues around conservation technology. How do we create tools that help people in the field? So you'll see behind me, this is just a picture. I'm not really there, but this is my lab, my conservation technology development lab. It's located in kind of the epicenter of conservation, which is downtown Los Angeles. That's not really the epicenter of conservation, but basically we're full of all the sort of like technology prototyping stuff that allows you to kind of build and develop circuit boards and mechanical products and things like that, all the way down to having our own pick and place and all of that. So it's the one thing I'll say is we're nonprofit, and everything that we create is open because we want to help to push the conservation technology movement forward. We work 100% on conservation projects. So sometimes that ends up taking us into more of like field science realm and other sorts of things. But all of our partners, we partner with organizations to build these technologies and take them out into the field. And all of our partners are always conservation organizations working on these sorts of things. When I say conservation technology, I don't have to go too much into this because I think everyone here understands it, but I mostly talk about developing conservation technologies in this alternative model that you see below. So the classic model for bringing tech into field work or conservation tends to be more opportunistic. It's technologies that were used in the military or were used in industry that were kind of adapted and brought into conservation. But the work that we do is really thinking about how do we rethink these tools with conservationists as the core user and build them up from that standpoint. And so that's kind of the framework from which I mentioned conservation technology. I mentioned that everything we do is open source. That's very intentional. I feel like open source is a big driver in being able to kind of push movements and industries forward. I sit on the board of the Open Hardware Association, so it's like something that we believe in very kind of deeply at our core. And then on top of it, we really push all our partners and we try the best we can to make sure everything's open data. We understand there's limitations around that in terms of like enforcement and security or academic sort of things, but beyond that, we try and push things to be as open as possible. And a lot of the tools we create, we try and make sure that they have an educational component on it so they can do STEM stuff. So very quickly, some of the projects we worked on in the past is animal tracking projects, smart buoys, acoustic sort of work, things around next generation fisheries monitoring, done a huge amount of work with drones. So that's taken me to, Cameroon and Congo and Republic of Congo and Sri Lanka and all sorts of different places to do drone work. But the bulk of what we've been doing lately is in this kind of whole idea around low cost sensors, kind of more actionable sort of systems. And so this comes at a way of us really trying to think about how we develop these tools for the field, but develop in a kind of a new modern product development framework, as opposed to like the traditional academic, ask a scientific question, a PI develops a tool, then they create something, and it turns out that a lot of people like that thing, and that thing becomes the product that everybody uses when they're measuring X, Y, and Z out in the field. We really think about it, using a user design kind of a framework and thinking through how do we create something that's beneficial to all. So, we've done sensors on glaciers and all sorts of different places, but the main thing that we've been working on lately is Fieldkit. And so Fieldkit is, I'm going to talk about Fieldkit because this is like the context that I'll explain some of our process as we go through the rest of this presentation, just so you kind of get a sense of that. But Fieldkit is basically, our work around how we can bring environmental sensing into a state where it's both using low-cost tools, but also very importantly, scientifically relevant. So you have the metadata you need, you have the traceability, you have the accuracy and kind of calibration sort of issues sorted out that you don't see a lot with the low-cost stuff. So in doing that, when we built it, as we're building Fieldkit, we're not only building hardware, but we're also building software solutions. So we built an app and a data visualization website. And each one of those things is a huge project in and of itself, but putting them all together is, I think, really key to create something that users can benefit from. So I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but it's super modular hardware, the app. The main reason why we did the app, and I'll talk about kind of the rationale behind this, is, hardware is something that I'm very familiar with. I love building hardware, but the problem is when you think about hardware from the standpoint of the user, a lot of people don't know how to code. A lot of people won't want to know how to code. They just want something that works. And if you want people out there using the thing that you build and you want them gathering good data from it, you have to kind of help them through that process of how to gather good data. And so we did that by building it into the app, building an onboarding process and a deployment process that allows people to take the right steps so that we know if they're measuring, air quality in Southern California or water quality in the Amazon, that they went through the right sort of steps so that when we see that data, everybody's like, okay, I could trust that data. That data seems like it's something that is beneficial and it's not just kind of, just armchair data or something like that. So we build all that into the app as a mechanism to allow people to kind of do that and interface with hardware when they don't know any technology, code and things like that. But then also one of the big things about conservation technology projects, and you have to think about it, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, is what happens next. Like, you build this beautiful shiny thing, you put it out into the world, and that doesn't mean that conservation problem is going to be solved, right? That doesn't give you kind of the outcome that you're looking for. And so you have to think about, once they collect that data or they use that tool, what happens with that data or the information or whatever you collect with that tool that really helps to solve the conservation problem that you're actually looking for. And so you could do that. We do that through building a website that allows you kind of manage, visualize, and push data to the right sort of places to do the things that you need to do. And then, since it's all open source, we document everything on kind of a wiki with like all the code and rationale and all that. Okay, so design for conservation technology. This is kind of a rough process. It's not really dialed in, and it kind of depends on the project that you're working on. But basically, at the core, what we're looking to do is try to make sure that that what you're building is the right thing to build, right? And there's a lot of really key things to think about as you're doing that. One is, do you understand the problem in a way that means that you're kind of like feeling for the person out there that's trying to get this information? And then next would be like, okay, once you understand the problem, how do you kind of understand everything around that problem that contributes to that problem and enables it or can stop it? How do you bring all that stuff into it? Once you kind of get that idea, then you can have a better idea of what these sort of gaps are and the constraints that you have to work around. And then finally, like you can kind of design your solution. Sometimes this process happens in different sort of orders, but it's good to actually go through this process at least once, even if you have a solution in mind initially. And it's really important to kind of make sure those solutions are ambitious. because obviously the set of tools that we have out in the world today aren't stopping extinctions. They're not stopping climate change, right? We need more ambitious ideas to really get that stuff through. And then the last bit that I'll talk about is like, you know, you have to be able to kind of pilot this in the right sort of way. So I have a lot to say about that. So understanding the problem, the way that we do that is we spend a lot of time talking to people who are actually working on these sorts of things. So I mentioned this before, but every single project that Conservify has or that we've ever worked on, we have a partner that we're working with in the field that understands that problem better than anybody else out there. And so even if it's something that I've worked on 100 times before, like I might know a lot about some sort of type of overfishing, but when I come into a project with another organization and that's their bread and butter, that's the thing that they know how to do, I'm only ears, and I ignore everything I've learned in the past. And how do we understand this problem from this person's standpoint so we can really get deep and get our heads around what's really happening there. The gap, find the gap. So next, what we do is we really try and understand, like, okay, so this is this ideal future state that you have, and here's where we are today, and like, how do we make that connection between what you need to get to that ideal future state? And that takes a lot of like thinking through what's currently available and stuff. The constraints depend entirely on what you're working on and the type of technology you're trying to develop. But there's a lot of really kind of important things that people forget about. Like they think about, you know, let's use a drone for this, but they don't understand, like, if that drone were to take pictures of something that's illegal, how does that information that drone collected actually lead to an actionable outcome for, you know, the prosecutors that would be enforcing that sort of thing? Or like, you know, what's the technological capacity in that part of the world where you're trying to implement this sort of thing, right? A lot of people like to, you know, spend time in places where, you know, you can get overnight deliveries of components and mechanical parts and all sorts of stuff, and then you go out into the field and one thing breaks and your thing doesn't work anymore, and that's just because like the capacity to get those sorts of tools in that area aren't ideal. And so those sorts of solutions are not going to work in a lot of the world, and you have to kind of think through that sort of thing. But there's a lot, like, how do you maintain it over time? What happens when the technology is at its end of life? How do you make sure that when it fails, it's failing in a way that's a graceful failure and not actually, you know, failing catastrophically and ruining the entire experiment or study that you're trying to collect? And so there's lots of things to kind of think about when you're doing that sort of thing. I talked about this earlier, but it's really important to kind of think wild about these ideas, make sure that these ideas are things that maybe people haven't done before, or like people have done in other areas, and you're trying to bring it into conservation. There's a huge amount of opportunity in this space to kind of change the way that people are working on stuff. And when you first start on designing your solution, when you're kind of sitting down, I would kind of suggest that you don't leave anything off the table. You bring in all the ideas, as even as crazy as they may sound, but they might actually turn out into something that works. And then next would be kind of the development and the pilot process. It's really important to kind of move as quickly as you can in this and break things. Failure is a key part of developing something that's robust in the field. So we pilot as quickly as we can. We create things, we put them out, we test them, they break, they come back, and we try and keep on doing that. It's also important to be careful about that sort of thing. So, you know, if you want to develop some sort of drone technology to do X, Y, and Z, and you don't pilot carefully, that means you could take it out to the field with your partners, and if something were to go wrong, that could change the impression that those people have about that technology. And it doesn't necessarily mean that technology wouldn't work for the things that they're doing, but it means that what it actually means is that, you know, you didn't do a good job at kind of expectation management when it came to that sort of thing, and that maybe that next iteration of that pilot would have worked perfectly, and then they'd be happy with that. And so there's a lot to kind of think about that. And finally, you know, understand your progress and kind of get an idea of how you measure that sort of thing. So that's a very high level look at what we're thinking through. I'm going to dive a little bit deep into a couple different areas that I think are really important nowadays in conservation technology to get right. So one is really understanding your user and what you're trying to solve when you're out there. So for Fieldkit, we had our initial set of users, people that we were working with in the past, field scientists that were deploying field kits, and then STEM educators that were really excited about that sort of thing, and they wanted to use that tool with their students. And through that, we had pilot projects where we work with the Wildlife Conservation Society on their citizen science for the Amazon project, deploying sensors throughout the Amazon basin, work with Smithsonian and the American Prairie Reserve to deploy Fieldkit in Montana, and UCLA and the Congo Basin Institute in the Jaw Reserve in Cameroon on an NSF project to deploy things there. But those are all more so field scientist based projects because those are the main people that we're working with. And once we decided we wanted to rebuild Fieldkit in a way that was accessible to a lot of people, we really opened our minds and started thinking about other people who would be interested in this sort of thing. So like citizen scientists, environmental justice activists. We put out a survey, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but we got, hardware hackers and artists and all sorts of people that were really interested in using this sort of tool and this sort of framework, but weren't really in our heads when we first designed that first iteration of Fieldkit, and it changed over time. And then those users, there's many different ways you can kind of like understand those users, and I'll talk about a couple of those in a second. But like that's further grown to this bigger group of people that we're working with. So for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day last year, we gave away 50 field kits that are just shipping right now because of COVID. But that has now gone to users in 27 different countries all across the world, and people who are doing hugely different things. And it's really interesting to kind of see how people will take the thing that you develop and then want to create their own kind of idea or project and something based off of that. So, so when you're thinking through kind of that user design process, you have to think about based off of what you're building, what are the opportunities? What are you trying to improve in that space? Like, how are you trying to create something that is helpful and provides value to people? And those kind of opportunities allow you to kind of wrap your head around what it is that you're actually building. And then you could do a bunch of user research. So we spent a long time kind of doing this and talking to different people, looking at other products, understanding what kind of the pitfalls are, and then mapping out what that sort of thing is. So, we did a bunch of interviews with those people. We laid out what we thought the life cycle of that product is. And then we went through it and we kind of talked about it as a team on like, how do we do this? So like, I'm just going to quickly flip through these, but these are some things that we were thinking through. Like, how do we set the right tone and vision for people who are using the tool that we have? Like, we want them to feel inspired by the tool. How do we build something that like reflects that? Community and onboarding are really important. So a lot of times people build something like a Raspberry Pi or something, and there's a huge community around that helps you through that. And Raspberry Pi and the companies that work with Raspberry Pi, they build a lot of onboarding materials to try and make sure that these things are like as easy as possible for anybody to be able to use. But there's a lot there to how to make sure that the thing you're making is not complicated and it doesn't feel like it's a huge task, because if it feels heavy, people aren't going to want to do it. And then you think about like, how are people going to come into using the thing that you have? Like, what are those sorts of entry points? Are they going to buy something from you? Are they going to maybe use the data down the line? Or, there's all these different ways that users are going to interact with this thing that you're building. And you should really think through what all those different sort of ways are, because that's going to help you understand what you need to build and how much time you need to spend on different sorts of things. The data, this is a huge part of it. So like everything collects data pretty much. And so like if you're collecting data, what happens to that data? How do you protect it? How do you make sure that users trust it? With Fieldkit, where we are, I think, honestly, probably pushing the cutting edge of user data privacy. We're really trying to be as strong as possible and set a precedent on how to deal with user data, because so often data is like sold and repackaged and manipulated and really put in a way that people can't use it, can't trust it in the long term. The other thing you have to think about is like what happens. How do you ensure data longevity? And so, not every project is around forever, right? I mean, MySpace used to be a huge thing. It's not really alive anymore. And so like, how do you make sure that like, if someone's collecting this data for conservation, that data becomes part of some sort of a record that's maintained for a long time, past when you're working on your project, past when other people sort of need it. So like this longevity is a really important question to think through when we're trying to create tools that answer big world-changing environmental problems. And then how do you kind of storytell around the things that you're building, or how can users use that to tell their story? This is a really important thing, because that's what inspires people to want to kind of contribute and take up that cause. There's a lot of really great projects that do a great job at this. I think iNaturalist is really awesome at this kind of side of things. And so it's really important to kind of think through, like, what is that story? What are you building? Why does it matter? And why do people want to become involved? And what is their story? And how do they kind of reinforce that thing moving forward? There's a big part that we think a huge amount about, and I think a lot of people maybe in the conservation tech space haven't really gotten to this yet, is the way people interact with your product, the UI, the design around that, like all that sort of stuff that is really big in the commercial space, but and important in the space that we're working. And I think there's a lot there that people need to kind of continue to think on. And then relationships with users, things moving forward, community moving forward. This is a big thing for project sustainability. I mean, if you want something to kind of take off and keep on working in the future, like, you really have to get the people who are using it to be excited about it, forming communities, understanding relationships, helping each other, and that whole sort of thing. And that's a big thing to kind of sort through as you're going through it. So we did a bunch of interviews. This is the first set of interviews that's right here, but we've done subsequent interviews where we had a UI UX expert actually help us through and create these sorts of archetypes. We sent out a survey, very simple survey to people, and got 1,200 submissions, which is like way more than I ever expected us to get. But it told us a lot about what people actually really want, what their backgrounds are, what they were kind of like looking for in Fieldkit. One thing that you'll hear in the design space is like user personas or user or archetypes. And so we set up user personas. This idea is that all the people who you can imagine are going to be using this thing that you build. Sometimes it's helpful to make like a fake person around what that thing is, and kind of define what it is that matters to them, what they're trying to get out of what you're building, what like their limitations are, and all that sort of stuff. And it really helps you to kind of understand that you're building the right thing in the right way. And we also mapped out journeys. So like each one of those people, like how do they come into the product? How do they understand how it works, get it up and running? What are they using it for? What's that entire journey from the very beginning all the way to the very end? This is a kind of an important thing to think through. Okay, so the pilot carefully and quickly part is kind of, it's pretty important to think through. One is really understanding where that solution that you're building fits into that user landscape and why people want to use it. What makes you different from other sorts of people, and that helps you kind of understand where you're going to pilot these things and test these sorts of things. And so once you have these user archetypes and stuff, you can make sure that you get your early versions of the stuff you're building in the hands of people that you can trust, that will give you good advice and opinions about what it is, and that can help you make something better. So you want to be able to put your idea in front of somebody that says, this is crap because of these 9 reasons. Like that's a good thing to know. You don't want to just take it and then eventually be like, okay, it's ready for the world, everyone download it and start going. That testing is an important part of of making sure that you're building something that's going to work. So testing in the field is important, both with people who know what they're doing and people who don't know what they're doing. One thing that in the tech development world, they do a lot of kind of A/B testing and a lot of this sort of testing where they take somebody who is just completely off the road and bring them in and put the tool in front of them and try and help. And so that first picture there was just some random person who was walking by the lab that we pulled in. We paid them for their time, but we said, hey, we're not going to tell you what this is. We're going to put it in front of you and see what you think about all of it. You even watch where people are clicking on things and like what people are putting things together, because that really informs how you're building that sort of thing. The last thing I'll say in this like kind of area is that almost always the thing that you think that you're going to build right now that's really going to change the world is not actually going to do that. Like the pivoting of your idea is important. Don't get stuck on something for too long just because you're stuck. You know, like if it turns out that that's not going to work, tweak things, change things, and move on to whatever the next thing is. There's always this sort of like movement that is really important in terms of getting to a solution that's going to work for people and that you can actually build. Tracking and measuring progress is really important. That's how you kind of know that what you're doing is the right thing. It's important to test all these assumptions that you have as you're kind of going through this sort of thing, and to pick the right sort of metrics. You want to make sure that you're building something that's actually trying to solve the problem that you're doing, and you're not building something that your partners or that your funder or that your team members want you to build. There's a big disconnect there sometimes between, you know, what's the tool that's actually going to give you the answers you need versus what do they want you to build. So in a lot of my kind of technology consulting I've done with NGOs, I've run into a ton of situations where people have said, I 100% need a drone for this. And then I go and I visit the site. They take me to where I'm at. They were standing on this cliff. They said, we need a drone because there's a bunch of illegal fishing happening right there. We can see it. And, you know, the solution isn't a drone for there. The solution is a pair of binoculars, and you give a case of beer to some guy who sits in a chair with a pair of binoculars, and he spots when this stuff's happening. You know, just flying a drone there doesn't make sense because there's no power. There's all these different issues around it. So it's really important to kind of think through like, what's the real thing that you need to do there. And then in terms of like measuring your actually what you're doing and evaluating it, there's a bunch of really good tools out there to basically see how your action results in different outcomes and if it actually has an impact on conservation or biodiversity. This conservation evaluation has a huge tool set where you can go through and look through like negative consequences, positive consequences, really get your idea around what you're doing. I actually just talked about pivoting, so that's an extra slide. And last I would say is like, if you want the thing that you're working on to actually have a big impact, I don't know, sometimes you work on something that is just more focused on a small scale problem, and that's great. Those sorts of solutions need to come to solve small scale problems. But if you want to have a really huge impact, you have to think a lot about scale and how do you create something that is able to grow and expand and isn't limited by certain things, limited by your ability to build those things. You have to really kind of always think about that next step. So I'm building Fieldkit right now for hundreds of users or thousands of users, but what's it look like if it's tens of thousands or more? Like, what do I need to do now? What relationships do I have to get with manufacturing partners or other organizations to ensure that like that next step is already in work as I'm in the middle of the previous step? And so you always have to kind of think about things in that sort of context. And then really understand the value that you're bringing. You know, what is driving this solution? Why do you think that what you're building matters? Like, why is it different than what's currently out there? That difference doesn't have to be huge. It could just be, we're dealing with data better than other people are dealing with data, but our technology at its core looks very similar to what someone else is doing. Then you have to realize like, what is going to cause people to kind of come over and use the thing that you're using. So it could be a lot around usability, around price. It could, be around how you deal with data. who your partners are. There's a lot of stuff there that kind of, how do you map out that value that you have? So, we mapped out what we think we're bringing in different spaces with respect to Fieldkit, did competitive analysis on products that were similar, or products that were kind of similar but not really totally similar, and really understand like what is the benefit that we're bringing that these other entities are not bringing. Oftentimes it's just you're focused on different markets. So, it's like, sometimes it's like, okay, if we compare Fieldkit to a product that's focused entirely on the STEM market, there's certainly things that are, we're going to lose on and we're going to gain on as we kind of think through that. But it's an important thing to think through as you're doing that. And then, it's very, very, very critical for you to think about the project that you're doing from an entire life cycle perspective. So, when it comes to the, how does someone get a hold of what you're doing, there's a huge amount to think about, especially when you get into the point of like, if you're building something you want to sell, a hardware product that you want to sell, like how it gets into other people's hands is a huge thing that we've gone through, that I'm happy to give advice to anybody who's curious about it. But like, if you want things available globally, there's a lot you have to think about in terms of like tax and fulfillment and distribution and all that sort of stuff. That's just massive. Or you can just go with a company that handles that stuff for you, so like you're being sold under another company, they're dealing with that whole sort of thing. You don't have to worry about it. It all depends on what you see the future of the project you're working on becoming. Do you see it becoming something that's bespoke and just kind of sold to very few people? Do you see it something that maybe is eventually going to live on Amazon or DigiKey or Adafruit or something? Then you have to think about it differently in that way. And then if you look at stuff from a software perspective, so if you're building apps or other sorts of things, that's a totally different framework to think about it. But like, it's very important to think about from that beginning phase. Once somebody gets that thing in their hands, how do they know what to do with it? Once they're out in the field, how do you make sure that they're doing something with it that's right, and that they're collecting that sort of data? If they have any issues, like how do they troubleshoot from the field? How do they kind of do all that sort of stuff in the field? Okay, it's out in the field for a while, it's gathering data, it's doing whatever it needs to do. Then once you have that data, what happens to that data? How do you help the users take that and do something good with it? That's a really important part, a really important value proposition, because a lot of times people build things that collect data and then just say, okay, the user figures it out, and that works, but it's not creating something that's like truly innovative in my eyes. Okay, pitfalls. These are things that I have seen over the last 11 years or so, and it's stuff to kind of pay attention to as you're kind of working through this. It might not all apply, but they're important. So the first I would say is not enough testing. This is a really big issue that people run into all the time. The majority, and I've done this a bunch of times too, so I'm not, I've done all of these things. But when it comes to testing, like a lot of times with conservation technology projects, it's, okay, we have to meet this deadline to go on this expedition at this date, and we're just hustling to build something, making sure it works. And usually you have like successes in the beginning. As you continue on, then you start having some issues. It's always like, pretty much has always been for me down to the line. So like right before we leave on the expedition, we're doing a bunch of iterations on stuff. We're making sure things work. And then at that point, I always look back and think, I really wish I had another 6 months to do this sort of testing. And this is something to kind of think in mind. Start your testing early, do it fast, do it often, keep on working on it, because you're always going to want to have more testing before you put something out into the field. Preconceived solution. This is a big one. So, a lot of people don't go through that process that I talked about, even if it's like more of kind of a hand wavy of that process that I talked about, and really understand what the user needs. This was a big issue years ago with drones. Everybody wanted to use drones for everything. And so I found myself a lot talking to people about what drones actually could and couldn't do, and why it is or wouldn't be a good solution for the work that they're doing. But it's very common for people to say like, oh, I think I need this shiny thing for this, when in reality they may not. They might, but they also may not. Unintended consequences. So this is like an important thing to kind of think through. I have this picture because there was a story a while back about these cellular bird tracking devices that ended up traveling to Sudan, and then someone took the SIM card out and used it for their phone and racked up like thousands of dollars of charges. And so it's important to think about these things that you build and how you make sure that like the different pieces of them can't have a consequence that ends up hurting the thing that you're doing or hurting your own project's sustainability, or there's lots of things to kind of think around in that sort of thing, but it's important to kind of get your mind around that. Also, abstract uses is an interesting kind of unintended consequence. Like, how can somebody take the thing that you're building and use it for something else that's not necessarily your intended use? This picture is, the famous story about malaria nets turning into fishing nets, but there's other things like that out there. And it's just really important to think that like, you definitely don't want your stuff to be used, have like an abstract use that's actually detrimental to what you're trying to do. So, poachers using that data to find the animal more easily or stuff like that. But it's really important to kind of wrap your head around what that is. Simple is always good. Simple is always really, really good. So, this picture is from the field work we did in Republic of Congo in Odzala National Park. The researchers there had a lot of issues around people damaging their camera traps, poachers damaging their camera traps. And they found the best solution to stop that was just this sign, putting this sign around it with a gorilla and a camera trap, so that they knew these camera traps, we don't care if you're in them, we only care if the gorillas are in them. So it's always important to kind of think through, is my idea too complicated? Am I making this too big for what it actually needs to be? And how do I bring that back to something that's simple and easy to use and cheap? I talked a lot about this, so I'm not going to go into it, but for getting the user, a lot of times we design things without really thinking about who's actually going to use them, use it, and how do we create something that works in that sort of context. Ambiguous data. So, I also mentioned this, make sure the thing you're building collects the data that you need to actually have the outcome that you're looking for. If you're building something and it collects a bunch of random data, and then it turns out that data doesn't solve these conservation problems, or it doesn't solve this kind of environmental issue that you're sort of facing, then what you built isn't actually for that thing, right? It's just it's a toy for something else, right? And so you have to think about, like, how do you create something that's actually, what's the data, what's the outcome that you're looking for, and how do you make sure that is directly driven to that outcome within all the constraints that I talked about before? So within the legal system, within the kind of technical system, within everything that you're thinking about, how do you make sure that those two things are connected? Pivot, peril. So Topher's a good friend of mine, but one thing he told me early on in some of the hardware stuff was they were doing was, the Rainforest Connection got very, very famous off of using old recycled cell phones. It became kind of this like sexy thing that they did. They took these old cell phones no one wanted and they put them in the rainforest. But then when they found that the limitations of those cell phones really kept them from doing the thing that they did, and they wanted to move over to their own kind of custom designed hardware and even to software now, which they do a lot of now, there was always this kind of issue around like, okay, well, we made our name on recycled cell phones. Like, how do we transition to something that is maybe no longer recycled cell phones and still maintain this kind of excitement around what Rainforest Connection is? And so that's an important thing to think about. It's not always avoidable, but it is, you can make that transition in a way that works really well. And so I think they've done a great job with it, but it's something to kind of keep in mind. Funder's dilemma. So this is basically my way of saying that you need to build what the project or what the issue that you're trying to solve actually needs, and not need to build what the funders want you to build. It's very easy to kind of say, oh, I'm going to build this solution because I see that there's money available for that sort of solution. You could do that if you want, but it's not necessarily going to get you to the outcome that you end up doing. Like, thinking through the real problem, the real users, having empathy for the situation, understanding the data that you need to collect, all that sort of stuff is way more important than building the type of tech that that the money is chasing after at that moment. And it changes all the time, you know, drones, AI, like moves kind of depending on whatever the exciting thing is at the moment. I just got a couple more of these. Next is scope creep. Make sure that you don't, I mean, I think maybe a lot of you guys know what scope creep is, but basically you like have an idea of what your scope is around a project. Make sure it doesn't keep on growing, because that could just lead to failure. I mean, we had a project a few years back where that was Fieldkit adjacent that just kept on growing. And it never allowed us to really look back at the technology and make sure that was fully vetted out, and that caused issues all along the way. So maintain what that is and kind of stay focused on what that scope is. Life cycle costs, big thing here. Understand that there are other costs beyond just the initial development or the initial manufacturing costs. You know, if it's a lot of data you're collecting, there's hosting fees, there's software licenses, there's disposal sort of related costs. There's a lot of things to think about when you're developing these sorts of things that are not just that initial, oh, it cost me $59 to build this PCB or whatever. You know, like there's a lot more there, and just keep that in mind. The public bias, this is more along the lines of like a lot of times people outside of the problem want a certain sort of thing, and that can help to drive what you're working on, and that you really have to focus on the problem and the user at its core. The biggest one, always 100% unrealistic timelines. Technology development is a hard thing. It takes a long time. Projects always want their data faster than you can expect it. So just understand that this is a thing and try and manage for it, and kind of keep things going. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of leave you with 3 different things at the very end here, and then I'll you know, I can stick around, or I don't know what we'll find out what happens next. But one is, if you're going to be working on this sort of thing, find something that you're really passionate about. It's really important to be inspired and passionate about the problems that you're working on. And so if it's an ocean issue, whatever it is, like get deep, understand that thing, and really like try and kind of find where your excitement lies about this sort of thing. Conservation technology is not an area where, you know, it works very well from a 9-to-5 standpoint. It's a very passion-driven thing right now, and so like you really have to have excitement about what you're working on. Second is to, you know, grow the skills, like understand what you're building, and like try and learn more and more as you can do that. It could be learning more about the conservation issues you're trying to solve, but also learning more about like the technology development process and the things associated with that. I'll add a little caveat here that like if you are not a good coder and you like know that, and you've tried and it's like really struggling with that moving forward, find somebody to work with who is a good software person. I'm a big proponent of finding the skills that you need in other people and like bringing them into your team and kind of working alongside them. I've spent a long time working on things that I was just not going to be as good at. I could have cut that time down, you know, to 10% of what it actually was if I just found the right person and collaborated with them. And lastly, I'll say just kind of keep on exploring. Like if you're working on a project, it doesn't work out, just like keep on looking. You'll find something eventually that work out. I've had 10,000 failures in my career, and that's just for me, like continuously trying new things and moving on. So thank you. That's it.